Hello everybody. On behalf of the Australian Human Rights Institute and the Australian Society for Computers and the Law, I welcome you to Breaking Chains, Combating Modern Slavery with Technology. I join you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay our respect to elders past and present from these beautiful lands, as well as the many lands from which you all gather. Our webinar today marks the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. In 2016, I looked for some statistics, and in 2016, the International Labour Organization estimated that at any given point in time, there were at least 40.3 million people in modern slavery, 15,000 of which are in Australia, and 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery are children. Now, to put these numbers into perspective, in 2020, Australia's entire population was just over 25 million people. So if you add our entire population, I had to double check these numbers because I just couldn't believe them. You add the 25,000 from Australia plus the population of New Zealand, and then you'll still be 10 million children, men and women short of the estimated number of modern slaves today. Staggering numbers. To address this issue and whether or not technology might be part of the solution, we've gathered a wonderful panel of experts to discuss the issues. Justine Nolan, Professor of UNSW Law, Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute, and advises companies, NGOs, governments and others on business and human rights, and is a member of the Australian Government's expert advisory body on modern slavery. We're also joined by Dr. Martin Risma, Senior Lecturer of the Management Department at the Faculty of Business at UTS, and the Program Director of the Master of Human Resources Management, also at UTS. He's the author of the paper, Can Blockchain Help Resolve Modern Slavery in Supply Chains, and co-author with Justine of the book, Addressing Modern Slavery. Kumi Naidu, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International, endorsed this book with these wonderful words. The book is a wake-up call and a powerful demonstration of how connectivity and collaboration can help us eradicate a systemic and urgent challenge. We're also joined by Ed Santo, the Industry Professor of Responsible Technology at the University of Technology, Sydney. Ed leads the UTS new initiative on building Australia's capability on ethical artificial intelligence. And from 2016 to 2021, Ed was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. I'm very excited about this session tonight, this afternoon, sorry, and the free-flowing discussion that will follow. If you'd like to join in and provide your questions, please do so via the Q&A function. Do that anytime because we'd like to incorporate your questions as the discussion progresses. Justine, if I can turn to you now, please. Please start the conversation with a little more about the significance of today's date for us here joining you today. Thank you, Justine, and the panelists.
Thanks so much, Marina, and thanks also to the Australian Society for Computers and Law for organising this great discussion today. It's great to have Martijn and Ed here to take a particular focus today on technology rather than just modern slavery generally. So, you know, why is it particularly significant today? Well, today marks the date of the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of the UN Trafficking Convention back in 1949. In adopting this treaty, you know, more than 70 years ago now, the UN, I mean, no doubt thought that it was on the way to substantively addressing and eradicating slavery and human trafficking. It was really a time of optimism because just prior to that, the UN had adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So there was a real focus on sort of the world moving forward after World War II. Prior to that, you know, in 1926, we'd seen the precursor of the UN, the League of Nations, had adopted the Slavery Convention. And the century before that is often referred to as the Age of Abolition, as major economies and countries throughout Europe and the US officially prohibited slavery. So we might ask in some ways what happened and why are we at the point today where slavery has increased rather than decreased? During the 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade, there were about 12.5 million people who were enslaved in the Americas. Today, as Marina said, there's more than 40 million people who are estimated to be enslaved, and 25 million of those are estimated to be working as forced labourers, commonly in global supply chains, making the goods that you and I use every day, the coffee we drink, the cars we drive, the clothes we wear. Most of these supply chains are tainted by, at the least, severe labour exploitation, and at its worst, modern slavery. So in marking this International Day for Abolition of Slavery, we really want to focus on this issue of, what is modern slavery? How is it relevant to us? The role of global supply chains, and dig deeper into particularly the role of technology in potentially addressing it. So let's start with our first question to Dr. Martijn Boersma. Can you tell us, Martijn, what do we mean when we talk about modern slavery, and how is it relevant to this sort of supply chains, as I've just mentioned?
Thanks, Justine. So effectively, when we talk about modern slavery, and I'm happy that you mentioned historic slavery or traditional slavery there as well, because the two terms are oftentimes conflated. People conflate traditional slavery with modern slavery. But what we find, one of the distinctive differences is that obviously after the abolition of slavery, people are no longer basically bought and sold into slavery. Rather, people are actually illegally controlled and exploited, and their avenues for exiting a particular employment relationship, in quotation marks, are actually, they're prohibited to leave that relationship for different terms, not necessarily legal ownership. There are obviously parallels between traditional slavery and modern slavery, but the important thing to note there is that the ways in which people are being exploited have basically evolved over time. We've obviously seen new business models, regulatory environments obviously continually change, and people that exploit, the people that are trapped in modern slavery make really smart use of that. So one example that I oftentimes refer to is relevant for Australia, where we have a lot of international students that are subjected to a working restriction in terms of the number of hours that they can work while they study. Now, anyone living in any central business district or surrounds in Australia knows that the cost of living is really high. So it's very tempting to work more hours than you are allowed to, simply to try and make a living. But at that exact point, obviously, you become a victim potentially of exploitation, as your boss might say that they will dob you in because you are, breaching your visa conditions. Therefore, they might say that you have to work for reduced pay or have to work more hours, etc. And there you can see that what started out as an initially quite normal employment relationship might actually slowly start to deteriorate by employers taking advantages, for example, of these instances. Now, to come to your question about the connection to global supply chains, well, I think you mentioned all the different commodities that are tainted by modern slavery. We all know the stories about coffee, about chocolate. Coming to the Australian summer now, pretty much everyone will soon be throwing their seafood onto the barbecue. And we know that, for example, the Thai fishing industry is known for its exploitation, where in some instances people have been held captive on those fishing vessels for sometimes decades on end. So, and with modern supply chains, and obviously we've all experienced the disruption in the age of COVID, and we've gotten to see how intricate exactly the global production system is. There's hardly a single commodity of which you can 100% with 100% certainty say that it's free of slave labor. If it's crossed the border, if a raw material is sourced from there, whether that's used in electronics or in other goods or products that are being produced, the length of the supply chain is so long that it's really hard for lead firms to have an oversight on that. So in that sense, we are all experiencing that challenge in trying to buy products that are produced in an ethically sound manner, while at the same time having very limited visibility over that. And that's also something obviously that companies themselves struggle with. And obviously we have in Australia now, we have the Modern Slavery Act as an instrument that can help to remedy that issue.
Thanks. So, I mean, what we're hearing is that modern slavery exists on this continuum of exploitation, and it might be that bad or unsafe working conditions can evolve into sort of that top spectrum of exploitation. So modern slavery generally, you categorize it as including things like human trafficking, forced labor, bonded or indebted labor, child slavery, for example. And these sound like extreme conditions that you think would never happen in Australia. And yet they do. They happen in Australia, they happen in our neighbouring areas, and they happen in most countries around the world. So, Ed, turning to you, Martijn mentioned that Australia had relatively recently adopted a Modern Slavery Act. Can you tell us what that act does and what it's asking companies to do, in a sense? And I know that particularly during your time when you were Human Rights Commissioner, you talked about this law, and you mentioned that this law could actually provide an opportunity for business rather than sort of be a punitive, legislative mechanism. So could you tell us a little bit about that act and how it's relevant to business?
Yeah, I mean, the core obligation of the Modern Slavery Act is to require companies to look for slavery, for precisely the reason that you, Justine, and Martijn were expanding on, namely that modern slavery really exists on a continuum of exploitation. It's not enough to look for, in a sense, the stereotypical image, which is really historical, of someone in leg irons to determine whether or not your company is directly or indirectly engaging in modern slavery. The fundamental question is whether or not there are highly exploitative practices that either your company directly is engaged in or other companies in your supply chain. And one way or another, you are complicit, perhaps even benefiting in a financial or economic sense from that. So I said the fundamental obligation of the legislation is to search. So what it requires companies of a certain size to do, and it's that they're large companies, is to look into their own operations and into their supply chains and look for those highly exploitative practices that would meet, I guess, a modern definition of slavery, and then to report publicly on what they have found. In the event that either the company itself or the a company in its supply chain is engaging in these sorts of exploitative practices, then it should also report on what the company is doing about it. And so the interesting thing there is that those are all process obligations. So there are already separate legal requirements that essentially say, thou shalt not engage in modern slavery. But what this is designed to do, this particular legislation, is provide a kind of a practical mechanism to better understand how those sort of practices can, in a sense, creep into a big company's operations or supply chain. And then do something about it. So the second part of your question was, how is this an opportunity for business? Well, look, I think the vast majority of businesses say very clearly that they do not want to engage in modern slavery, either directly or indirectly. And I think we should take that at face value. I think that's true. The vast majority of businesses don't want to do that. So I guess what this legislation allows them to do is, or enables all of them to do, is to take a more rigorous approach to make sure that they are rooting it out when it occurs. I mean, what we heard prior to the passage of this legislation is that there's a kind of a perverse incentive for companies that are not kind of willing to live by their values to sort of say, oh no, we would never do that sort of thing, but they can still get the kind of financial or economic benefits if companies in their supply chain in a hidden way are engaging in these sort of exploitative practices, and they're using those practices as an opportunity to undercut in terms of how much they charge the very large company at the end of that chain. And so I think this legislation has some, it's not perfect, but it has some potential to level that playing field and to ensure that companies can do the right thing without necessarily being disadvantaged by doing so.
So, I mean, what you're basically saying is that it's using sort of the disclosure tactic as a way for companies to be more transparent about their activities and hopefully push a rise to the top, really, of among companies that would do this. And so, before we go sort of to look at the tech side in a little bit more detail, Martijn, is this working? I mean, we've had a question from the audience come in, and a reminder that you can post your questions in the Q&A section, basically saying, is this effective? Are there any penalties in relation to this act? Or is it just companies doing it because they should? And is it too early to make an assessment about whether this new law is going to be effective in addressing modern slavery?
Yeah, those are all good questions. I think to judge the effectiveness of the Australian Modern Slavery Act is perhaps a little bit early, but we can look at the UK Modern Slavery Act, obviously, which is very similar in nature to the Australian one. And I think one thing that we can say with certainty is that it's definitely raised awareness amongst organizations that have to report about what happens in their supply chains, many of which who probably would have, and I've been in these boardrooms where people sort of scoffed at the idea of modern slavery and in some way, shape or form being connected to their company, which I think is a mindset that you now won't encounter in boardrooms and in organizations any longer. In regards to the actual effectiveness on the ground, I think that it's very early to say, what's really happening. I think that we, in an analysis, in the many reports that have come out that have analyzed statements produced by companies, we see that there's a lot of room for improvement. So we see basically a spectrum of, well, some companies just approach it a bit as a tick box compliance exercise. I have to produce a modern slavery statement. To all the way on the other end, companies that actually are devoting time and resources to looking into their supply chain and operations and have people actually produce meaningful reports and take some meaningful actions. But as obviously the Modern Slavery Act requires, an important part of that is reporting against the progress that you've made. And since we've only obviously introduced the Modern Slavery Act in 2018, and we've just seen the sort of first couple of reporting cycles there, it's early to judge whether that has worked. I think the people that have analyzed the UK Modern Slavery Act very closely feel that the act as a legal instrument can be potentially be made a bit sort of stronger due to some sort of potentially and it was mentioned before, a fine, for example, for non-compliance that could sort of help some companies report, because, and I'll finish with that, but in the first reporting cycle of the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, there's actually a limited number of companies listed on the stock exchange in London that actually obliged with the act. So it's a sort of comply or complain mechanism, or sorry, comply or explain mechanism. And many of them didn't actually bother to comply with the act. Now, the idea is obviously that if you don't comply, then your shareholders will slap you on the wrist, etc. But I think more telling, even a lot of companies with large government contracts, UK government contracts, also failed to report under the Modern Slavery Act early on. So even if the customer and the slap on the wrist could potentially be coming from the UK government, even in that instance, those companies that were awarded those large government contracts also initially didn't bother really to report under the Act. So I think in that sense, we have to also ask whether the enforcement mechanism is one that can work.
Can I just jump in on that? I mean, there's one really interesting aspect to modern slavery that I think is worth noting, and that is it can be difficult to assess success by the usual metrics. Like when something is hidden, and modern slavery often is hidden, drawing that out to the surface, is that a success or a failure? In other words, if a company shows that in its supply chain it has identified a whole sort of suite of bad behaviours, on one view, it might be very worried about drawing that people's attention because it might look like a very bad company. So really the focus is not solely, so maybe even not primarily, on that part of the equation. It's on the other part of the equation. It's what are you doing about it? So if you identify modern slavery, what are you going to do to make sure that those exploitative practices are rooted out? And sometimes, I mean, there's some really sort of positive stories about how a company, a large company will say, look, we're still kind of open to trading with this smaller company in our supply chain, but the condition is that you treat your employees fairly, and you don't engage in these terrible exploitative practices. And maybe we're even open to paying a little bit more for the product if that's what's going to be necessary to achieve that. So that's when the legislation is operating as it's intended to. But in reality, I think that there are some question marks about how effective it is.
Yeah, so what we've got is potentially a mixed bag at the moment, that we've got a law that's asking companies to report. Most companies that should be reporting are reporting, but the quality of the reports and the information that's being unveiled is not necessarily that substantive focus that might help us get to the root of this problem. But what you're saying, Ed, also is that it's really important that we start to accept that we have to normalise they're actually identifying this problem. So let's not keep it under wraps. We actually need for companies to say, yeah, it is a problem, and here's where we found it. So, let's get to the technology side of this discussion, because if business is to be part of the solution in addressing modern slavery, let's think about some ways that might be. And so there's a number of examples that are being trialled out there, and there's various apps. The use of big data, artificial intelligence, and blockchain are some of the examples of technology that sort of promise to solve, at the moment, most of the world's problems. So let's see how they might work to modern slavery, and then we'll also come to the question of what there might be limitations in relation to this. So Martijn, starting with you, and perhaps can you give us an example of where technology is being used or trialled to look at and help prevent modern slavery?
Yeah, there are a few examples that I can give. So, for example, satellite imagery is an important one that has been used mainly to locate brick kilns in India and surrounding countries, where we know that people might be experiencing, sadly, intergenerational slavery, actually, in sort of forms of bonded labor that are also sometimes hereditary. So with satellite imagery, you can actually spot where those brick kilns are, and therefore you can sort of locate particular areas where people might be held captive. And obviously those areas might be quite remote. So that helps in pinpointing where that exploitation might be taking place. Financial institutions have also become more active in this space. So I'm aware of a trial a few years back with Western Union, IBM, and Interpol, who came together and basically took a big data approach and said, well, actually, perhaps in all these, I don't know how many transactions that take place every day, using sort of a big data and machine learning approach, perhaps we are able to see particular patterns that actually are indicative of for example, human trafficking or modern slavery, whether that is sort of frequent, cash transactions to sort of suspicious locations, etc. And rather than basically having people obviously looking at that data, which probably is not possible, you have, an algorithm or machine learning applied to that, so that you can actually see those patterns, and then on that basis, potentially take action. And then finally, I think blockchain is also a very important, technological development that is increasingly being connected with efforts to address modern slavery. Although in that sense, I have to say that blockchain is mostly applied from a sort of provenance perspective, so that it's used to basically track the movement of a particular commodity throughout the value chain, and obviously that's done, through scanning QR codes, whatnot. I'm personally involved in a project that is focused on the Australian cotton industry, and there they've gotten, in my mind anyway, I find that incredibly enhanced, where they have sort of a sort of DNA spray that they apply to the cotton as it moves through the value chain, and even if that cotton then itself is blended with different types of other cotton further down the value chain, they're still able to see what the provenance, or at least part of the provenance of that good is. The problem there, though, is that showing where a good comes from obviously allows you to identify whether a good has been or has not been produced in a high-risk country or a high-risk area or region. But it doesn't obviously entirely speak to the circumstances in which a particular good was produced. So I think that is still problematic. How we can trace how a commodity how a commodity moves throughout the value chain, but at the same time, having an adequate log of the conditions surrounding that. And you mustn't forget that the people that are in modern slavery are oftentimes hidden from sight, so they're not like your regular employees. And so to have an adequate record reflective of the conditions in which a good was produced, that's a very challenging factor. So ultimately, if we can make that happen and we combine that with blockchain, then I see great prospects for that technology. But right now, it's mostly focused on mapping the provenance of a good and its journey throughout the value chain.
So this relates to one of the questions that has come in from Kay, talking about using technology as a sort of a mapping tool and tracing tool. The question is, how strong is the link to product labeling? Is there a strong enough awareness of supply chains for components in products? For example, New Zealand fertilizer companies sell blood phosphate sourced from Africa. Would agricultural products grown with the use of that fertilizer be caught too? So this is looking at, an argument some decades ago now was also looking at blood diamonds coming from Sierra Leone, or polysilicon coming from Xinjiang in China, and looking at that supply chain. So how does it relate? Does it catch all things within the supply chain, and how might blockchain help us with that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Ultimately, you can combine basically if it is a value chain for a product and all the goods that are basically put into the ultimate product that's being marketed, then technically it's possible to trace every sort of other commodity that's used or raw material that is used in the production of that end product. But I'm happy this question was raised, because right now the trial, basically we're looking at lots of trials with regards to blockchain technology in supply chains, and it hasn't sort of spread to the degree that you would be able to track a very intricate product that is consists of many other sort of semi-finished products that has many different raw materials that are put into that. So the trials that are being run are very selective. We've seen it with diamonds that you mentioned. Blockchain is used in that. We've seen it actually in the meat processing industry as well, but then for a completely different reason. That's just to focus on how long particular meats are in transit, whether they've been cooled enough, etc., whether they can still be sold on in other ways. But right now, the trials are at a relatively limited scale, but in sort of from a technological perspective, it would be possible to combine those different supply chains and track more complex materials as well. Right now, it's mostly on like raw materials such as diamonds. Yeah.
So we'll come back to some more examples in a minute, but Ed, as we start to look at the potential for technology to help prevent and address this problem, what do we need to think about when we're thinking about technology-led solutions to human rights issues? What are some of the things we need to be wary about, or what might be some of the limitations or impacts it might have on human rights as we increasingly look to technology to help us solve this problem?
Yeah, I want to mention a couple. So I think Martijn gave a really good example right at the start of that list about the use of satellite imagery coupled with a machine learning tool to identify where particular types of kilns were used, and maybe you can infer from that the potential for exploitative practices in that specific area. So that can be very, very powerful. And when you start to publicize that data, people can make choices about it. But what we've also seen when you start to publicize that data is it can have a range of unintended consequences. There's a very, very similar tool that was used by a very well-meaning NGO that basically was using satellite imagery coupled also with machine learning to identify people who were fleeing from conflict zones. And then that information was then made publicly available with the intent of helping kind of aid agencies get to those people and provide assistance to them. the inevitable happened, of course, which was that combatants who were trying to target those civilians then had the perfect kind of geolocation data to be able to target those civilians more effectively. And so, you know, there's a $3 term to this, which is dual affordance. So much of this technology can be used benignly as well as in, you know, to cause enormous and unjustified harm. And so we need to be thinking really conscientiously about how to avoid that. I meant if I can jump in with a second one. So a number of the examples that Martijn gave were essentially machine learning, pattern recognition examples. And that's, you know, such a powerful new kind of technique that we've been able to kind of supercharge through massive increases in computing power. The downside is that, you know, again, machine learning is a $3 term for pattern recognition, right? It's finding correlations between two things. And some of those correlations are meaningful. Some of the things that we find that seem, you know, X seems to correlate with Y, this particular feature seems to correlate with this particular exploitative practice. Some of those things are true, but some of them just aren't, right? Some of them, in fact, most apparent correlations, the vast majority of apparent correlations are meaningless. And machine learning tools, especially in difficult areas like this, often find it very difficult to differentiate between what is a meaningful correlation that might actually shed some light on our understanding of the world, in this case, understanding of who's engaging in exploitative practices, and the opposite.
So that raises a great point, and it's related to two questions that have just popped up. One from Elizabeth, which says, is there a capacity for blockchain technologies to assist with data quality in terms of, say, the push by business to automate reporting processes, which seems to open to exploitation without on the ground or independent oversight? Because this brings to mind, you know, the question, one of the critiques around blockchain is that sort of, you know, it's garbage in and garbage out. What you put in is what you're getting out, but is there validation for this along the line? And the other question that goes in tandem with this is from Fred Chilton. Hello, Fred. Fred was my first boss when I was a lawyer 30 years ago. Neither of us have aged since, I think. But have the travel restrictions flowing from COVID-19 prevented investigations of suppliers and resulted in more exploitation? So starting with you, Martijn, that question around putting information into blockchain, how you might validate it, and then what's the backup? Like if we're not being able to access certain places and go to places where we think this exploitation is, particularly during COVID, you know, where has come from that? And then I'll give you an opportunity too, Ed, to come in on this. So Martijn, starting with you.
Yeah, I think obviously the data, and obviously you correctly mentioned the motto garbage in, garbage out. The data that goes in is very important. And in the paper that we authored on this issue, and this refers back to something I said before, basically people that are trapped in modern slavery are hidden from view. And if you have a blockchain set up, then you have to have some sort of consensus protocol set up, obviously, of people verifying the transaction that is taking place. So that already brings to the forefront a very complicated issue, which is that someone who might be potentially subjected to modern slavery is unlikely to be part of that consensus protocol in verifying the conditions surrounding a particular transaction of a good or a commodity going through a supply chain. And even if you do have, you know, a representative from the work floor or local union as a stakeholder that says, okay, we verify these circumstances in this factory with this particular transaction, and we certify that this is okay, then again, modern slaves are oftentimes hidden from sight. And the problem there is obviously that, again, they might not be given a voice in this context. Now, the problem with that is, and this is obviously blockchain is immutable, the transactions are there, and you know that's it. The problem with that is that potentially, and this goes to a point that Ed made before about unintended consequences that might also come from the use of technology as well, is that you might actually be sort of let's say laundering particular goods through the use of blockchain, because ultimately, you know, the people that are in part of the consensus protocol, they verify whether a good is produced in ethical circumstances. And then someone further up who sees that will, you know, say, okay, well, blockchain is immutable and this is fine. And clearly there's a record of this transaction and it works in the circumstances. Whereas that record itself might actually not be accurate. But if we sort of place that much faith in that record itself and in blockchain as technology being immutable and whatnot, then you could obviously run the risk of actually almost sanitizing those goods that are potentially tainted by modern slavery through the use of blockchain technology. And I think that's something to be very wary about.
Ed, did you want to follow up on that? And I mean, it sort of relates in some ways to this, you know, the wariness you're raising around relying on pattern recognition and correlations that perhaps are not always there, around that, the veracity of the information that we're relying on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Basically, I agree with everything Martijn said. I think what we need to remember is that technology can be a really cheap, and let's be honest about it, and therefore efficient way of throwing up leads for us to investigate further. And you know, we need to remember the second part of that, which is we often need to, we almost always need to investigate further to determine whether or not those leads are what they might appear at first blush to be. I think there's a lot of breathlessness about blockchain, and in some regards it's justified, right? Like, there are enormous opportunities across a wide range of areas to make blockchain incredibly effective. I've come across too many people who've said, however, you know, I've lost my partner to blockchain. You know, he or she has fallen in love with blockchain and can talk about nothing else. And I think we do that a little bit with new technology. Is sometimes we are so enamored with its positive potential, we lose a sense of proportion about what it can achieve. So sometimes we go to either extreme, where you go, I'm not going to touch that because, you know, it's not what I'm used to, or we're going to use it for everything. And either of those extreme responses tends to be wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, and it's also, I think, as one of the questions in the chat noticed as well, that it might not necessarily be using one form of technology in isolation. It's blockchain combined with perhaps big data on certain issues. And I mean, one of the issues that you've both recognised with modern slavery in particular is that it's often a hidden crime. So it can be difficult, whether it's opaque in the supply chain, because it's usually down the lower tiers of a supply chain that it's most common, and supply chains themselves can be quite complex. But it might also be happening where there's not a lot of worker empowerment, or it's difficult to get information. So one example I gave earlier, in particular at the moment that's in the news a lot, is Xinjiang in China, where there's, you know, widespread credible allegations of the use of forced labour, from everything from the production of solar panels to apparel. But it's really difficult to get access to that region. And mostly we're sort of getting access to information from whistleblowers who've got out of the region. There's another example that Julie has raised on the chat around a particularly in the Philippines, a project that's going on where there again is not much information. So Martijn, what about the use of technology in terms of giving workers a voice, or empowering workers to be the monitors, to enable them to speak up and to hear more about what's going on? What potential is there for some form of technology in that way to be using it to transmit information?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely vital, and there's a trend in the sort of the social responsibility of companies space where we talk more about worker-driven social responsibility rather than corporate social responsibility. So the idea that workers have a key voice in basically verifying whatever circumstances they're subjected to is super important. And technology can help there. A few years back, colleagues at UTS and as well as UNSW, actually Laurie Berg and Basina Farbenblum, they produced a report on the types of apps that are being used for worker engagement to give workers a voice. And as part of a research project, I opened up that report myself not too long ago. And sadly, so many of those great apps that were listed in that report had been discontinued. So clearly, while the idea of empowering workers with an app and give them voice to, you know, raise concerns about the conditions that they are experiencing, that in itself is theoretically a great idea. Somehow, practically, that's not necessarily, you know, coming to the, you know, it's culminating in many apps that do that exact thing. And to refer to another project that I'm part of, which focuses on the Australian cleaning supply chain, where Also, a lot of workers are being exploited, underpaid, being forced to work overtime, etc., etc. The idea there was as well to create an app where they could ultimately report sort of issues in their workplace. Interestingly, from engaging with cleaners and by having focus groups, we found that a lot of activity just happens in their own portal. So they are already part of a WhatsApp group where they sort of raise issues amongst themselves. So it is happening. I just don't think that it's sort of formalized in one particular app yet that people are using. But that idea of giving workers voice and enabling them to make it more and more easy to raise issues, I think that's a critical area. Although sadly, and that's the last thing I'll say about this, in the analysis that we've done, Justine and I, of modern slavery reports so far, there's oftentimes talk about modern slavery hotline that people can call, but that just turns out to be the phone number of the HR person sitting in a completely different country. So there's also particular low-tech responses to, in principle, a good idea, which is giving workers more voice.
So Ed, is one of the issues here when we sort of look at integrating tech more into helping really big social problems like this, a question of trust? For us to rely on technology to solve the problem, does it mean that the people impacted have got to understand the technology or have got to be able to trust the information they're putting in and then expect that something will change when they do so? So is there still that sort of, that need for, maybe it's education, but maybe it's the human element as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, without wanting to be too highfalutin about it, it's a real anthropological problem, because some of these questions that we're trying to answer when it comes to modern slavery, digging deep into supply chains, they're actually really difficult because there can be some weak signals that you don't want to miss. And so just using very conventional human kind of means of deduction, it can be very, very difficult to do it. So that makes us very susceptible if there's someone out there who's saying, I've got this wonderful technological solution for you, and it'll just kind of magic away that really difficult analysis and examination that you have to undertake. And so we're very susceptible, as I say, when people offer that up to us. And we can be overly credulous, there's another term for that, which is algorithmic deference, and it's really dangerous. So what we need to do is, as you point out, Justine, be rigorous. So educate ourselves on how the technology can be used well, how it can kind of augment our own kind of innate human intelligence, but where the limitations are. And what are the sorts of parts of a complex analysis we should not be using the relevant technology for?
So there's a great question here from Andy Symington. Hi, Andy. That there's a danger here that we are just reshuffling supply chains rather than actually eliminating the harm to people, meaning we're sort of diverting it to other jurisdictions where perhaps it's lower down the supply chain or harder to find. So he asks, how can we focus technological solutions on actual elimination of risk to people rather than elimination of risk from the supply chain? Difficult question, and what the Modern Slavery Act is trying to do is basically focus companies on not the risk to the company, but the risk the company poses to others by their activities. So, that question around how we bring back the focus to people. So Ed, perhaps start with you on that one.
Well, thanks a lot, Justin. It is a really important question, but a really difficult one. I mean, there's certainly anecdotal evidence that I've come across of companies doing a really good job, in a sense, of identifying, parts of their supply chain where there's modern slavery, and then they say, okay, that's it, we're chopping that bit off, and we're just going to go to another company which is offering exactly the same terms, and maybe even, literally exploiting the same individuals. And it's just like a kind of a phoenixing. So there are, again, there are sort of machine learning techniques that can help to identify the sorts of patterns that might be present when there are these sort of artificial ways of evading modern slavery legislation. It's no more than lead generation, but it's still really useful as lead generation. So you still then have to kind of go and assess using rigorous means, whether that is indeed what's happening. But I don't, to be honest, and Marta and Justine, you're more knowledgeable about this specific area than I am. I've never come across kind of a really compelling technological solution where we can just set and forget. I think that strikes me as really dangerous, that prospect, because it's probably unrealistic.
Marta?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I was actually already typing in the reply to Andy's question along those lines with the set and forget type situation, or perhaps that was a different question that I did answer. But obviously we've seen obviously the social auditing regime in the last sort of 3 decades being not particularly great at substantively improving conditions for workers on the ground. And one of my concerns with technology is that we and companies will to a degree see blockchain, but also other types of technology that allow automation. We'll see that as a way in which they can streamline that sort of process of social auditing, automate it, and obviously in that sense you are then taking something which is already shown to be relatively broken, social auditing of supply chains, and applying a technological fix to it, which might give it a new lease of life and might give people the impression that we're applying all this new technology and doing such a great job in avoiding exploitation elsewhere. And exactly that will then happen, that set and forget notion of like, well, we have a dedicated blockchain platform or something that focuses on that issue. And look, we see here that all these items XYZ show no exploitation, etc. Yeah, if we stop there, then obviously we set ourselves up to fail horrendously. So I completely agree with you there, Ed.
I mean, and one, because there is tech that here can be really useful. So one example you raised earlier, Martine, around the cleaning accountability framework, which is a relatively new initiative in Australia, which is trying to provide basic tech options, but also worker empowerment options to provide better working conditions for workers in Australia's cleaning industry, which is that sort of multi-tiered supply chain. So they've also used tech, particularly in competitive tendering, right, to get better, more reasonable rates, to work out rates that are going to be actually sort of applicable across the industry that would provide a reasonable. Can you tell us a little bit more about how tech has been used in that initiative?
Sure. Yeah, so that's in the cleaning accountability framework, as you said. So apart from the worker voice component, which is very important, where apps were under development, but they're also always included in independent audits that take place as part of the supply chain. But then a very central tool to the cleaning accountability framework is what they call the pricing schedule. And I'm not going to use the word big data because obviously big data is tremendously large. But what they've done, actually, they've collated information about every building in Australia's CBDs that has been subject to cleaning contracts. So basically, they have information about the square meterage of buildings. They have information about the users of those buildings, whether it's a lunchroom or it's a toilet or whatnot. And on that basis, what they've done is they've created acceptable, what they call productivity rates. So in other words, when a cleaning contractor goes and tenders for a contract that is being attended by a large building owner, given that all that data that they use in the pricing schedule, they know exactly how much money needs to be in the contract in order to pay the cleaner correctly and make sure that they have acceptable productivity rates so that they're not overworked. So that's an approach where basically you are avoiding that sort of low balling of tenders. And this was one of the questions that was asked that I saw, like, how do we move away from that sort of race to the bottom in terms of, costs and that sort of thing. This actually puts a bottom in the market where by using all that data from those different buildings in Australia's CBDs, they say, well, this is depending on obviously the building that you're tendering for, this is the minimum amount of money that needs to be in a contract in order to make sure that workers get paid all their entitlements while they're not being overworked. So that is one of the ways in which data is being used to put a bottom in the market, and in this case, the Australian cleaning industry. Yeah.
So, I mean, what we're seeing is that, particularly in this area of modern slavery, there's this sort of real mixed methods approach that is being taken, that we've got a law around disclosure that is largely relying on companies to report. But from what we've seen after the first year of reporting, companies are reporting, but there's just mixes around the quality of that. And there was also a couple of questions around the interactions between modern slavery legislation or mechanisms and also anti-corruption, anti-bribery and anti-money laundering impacts. And as Martijn has answered, there has been some movement on this, particularly in the EU. But we'll also see there is actually a real interaction between corruption and modern slavery. There is this overlap. The UK Bribery Act, sort of is starting to look at involving companies in due diligence more by bringing in the adequate procedures defences. And there is, I think, a crossover between what's happening in corruption and what needs to happen in modern slavery law. They seem to sit on the opposite ends of the spectrum, where anti-corruption laws tend to be very criminally focused. Modern slavery laws are quite soft in their accountability. And there's a real middle road where both of them can work. But, what is evident is that both do need the involvement of business in relation to this, that it's not going to be solved by just passing a law. So one of the questions that has come up is in relation to an ongoing or shared culture of shareholders and departments trying to drive down costs in their supply chain, which is a driver of modern slavery. And so, what you see then is outsourcing. So how do we change this? How do we focus more on the business model and purchasing practices to also address the problem? Martijn?
Oh, I thought you were going to do that to Ed.
No, I'm setting you up, and then I'm just expecting you to magically come up with the answer.
No, good. No, that's a very good question. And not too long ago, and sorry for sort of the international audience to bring the example, to come up with another Australian example, but not too long ago, I was looking through the procurement policies of Australian states and territories, and basically all of them were just only focused on value for money, which meant that obviously we're just gonna, get the cheapest possible contractor we can to whatever, clean our government building or XYZ. And it makes sense because you are spending ultimately tax dollars to do that. But obviously, when you do that, when the only concern is that you make sure that you spend as little as possible, then obviously you're putting yourself in high risk area. And that is exactly what happened in the cleaning supply chain. Building contractors were never asking any questions about anything. They simply accepted the cheapest contract that was out there, and that was that. Now we know that when you do that, you run into trouble. And now this is why the cleaning accountability framework is actually working, because building owners have also become aware of the reputational risks that they are potentially might be suffering if it's found that people are being exploited that clean their buildings. So in terms of your question of how do we move away, how do we change purchasing practices, I think that risk lens, and not just a risk from a financial or reputational perspective, but also, what risk how do we put workers at risk through our procurement practices, and how might our sole cost focus actually negatively impact other people? I think that's a mindset, a change in mindset that's slowly occurring. And just to bring it back to the Modern Slavery Act, and in terms of how it's been effective, I think that's one thing that the Modern Slavery Act has done, is basically said to companies, simply looking for the cheapest possible contract to get your goods and services in, that's not good enough, especially in industries that already have sort of like a low barrier of entry, where people are sort of being paid low wages. Just focusing on cost is not gonna cut it. And and obviously the incentive there for large companies is the potential reputational risk that they suffer if it is indeed exposed that they are somehow connected to exploitation or modern slavery.
So we are out of time, and I want to really thank you both for this really interesting discussion, and particularly the questions from the audience of really well-informed questions in relation to this. To completely sit on the fence, to sum it up, we think, yes, technology has got potential, but we really need to bring in and look at it through a human rights lens, and also, take account of, what are we trying to achieve? Questions around impact on the people who are, at the bottom of that supply chain, questions around privacy and trust as well. But, this is definitely an issue that we're going to keep following in the future. So thank you both so much. And Marina, I'll hand it back to you to close.
Well, thank you, Justine, Ed, Martine, for your time, your excellent and thought-provoking conversation, and your very important leadership in this area. I have to say, I started feeling quite pessimistic about whether or not a solution could be found, and now at the end of our session, I feel a renewed sense of hope for the future. Change is possible, and together we can hopefully get there. We would like to thank our supporters, UTS, Blockchain Australia, and the team of Thomson Reuters who made this event possible. In fact, Thomson Reuters Practical Law have produced a toolkit for resources on modern slavery and have kindly offered complimentary access to those resources to all who registered for this event. We also look forward to you joining us for future events in the new year. Take care and enjoy your day.